How to paint realistic fall leaves in watercolors. This time brown maple leaf with a beautiful curve for more realistic view. An outline drawing is done, which is available for download, and removing the excess amount of the graphite marks from the paper. With an elastic eraser, rolling over the paper surface so that we are not damaging the paper, and removing as much graphite as possible. Now taking color palette, round synthetic brush and watercolor set, we can start mixing colors. I will be using lemon yellow, Indian yellow, Sennelier red, alizarin crimson, pearlin violet, and ultramarine blue. For this, brown, reddish maple leaf. Now let's mix. For the first one, I'm placing lemon yellow, second one Indian yellow with a little touch of Sennelier red, third mix Sennelier red, alizarin crimson, a little touch of pearlin violet, fourth mix pearlin violet, Indian yellow, a little bit more of pearlin violet to get really this reddish brownish color, a little bit more of Sennelier red, and you can adjust so that you can see this suits for you. Pearlin violet for the fifth mix, Indian yellow, and little touch of ultramarine blue. For the first mix, I'm adding a little bit of Indian yellow and lemon yellow as well. Now on the left side there are very light parts of the edge of this maple leaf, and I'm with white eraser, this is a razor pencil, removing more graphite, and with the bigger brush wiping off the dust from the paper. Let's start painting. Be sure that your water is clean after mixing watercolors. For the first layer we need very clean watery layer, but that watery layer is very small amount. Applying with round synthetic brush water to the inner part of this maple leaf. I'm leaving the curves not covered with water, and as you can see, water isn't flowing anyway, even when I'm lifting the paper up. Starting with the darker part on the reference on the left side, and first mix lemon yellow with Indian yellow, and with wide and big brush strokes applying this watercolor mix. As you can see from my color palette, I'm not using very saturated watercolor mixes, not big and full watercolor mixes. The aim is to be very transparent and to lay layers. We're not aiming for first or one layer of watercolor layers and then call it done. It can't be done in realistic painting with few layers. Your painting can only be similar to illustration, not realistic painting. In order to get your subjects with watercolors to look realistic, we need to layer watercolors. With transparent layers, we can go on and on, add layers, colors, details, tonal values, and by some time, with a lot of layers, we will get a very saturated, rich, and realistic subject. I'm constantly checking my reference, and I very strongly suggest you open the reference, which is available. You can download it right beside the tutorial and zoom in each section that you are working on. I'm not adding reference to the tutorial screen. It's not possible in realistic painting just to have an overall look at the subject and then paint. We need to go into detailing, into depth. That's why I always have my reference right beside me, or right beside the tutorial or another gadget, and you can really zoom in each section you are working on. While the surface is wet, I'm adding more and more color, still transparently, very accurately, as you can see, constantly checking reference because all the information that I need is there. I'm leaving the curved areas out of this painting part. That will be painted later. I'm working only on the inner part, the darker part of this maple leaf. And as you can see now, I'm adding watercolor layer and leaving some yellow parts revealed because I can see from the reference that there are yellow parts, especially around those dark veins, still visible. Adding a little touch of Perlin Violet to my color palette and placing that darker spot that I see in the reference on the edge of my painting. And still the surface is slightly moist, and I'm adding a little bit more for the contrast in the darker parts of this inner part. Carefully around that curved area. We don't want to go in that area, not yet. Washing my brush, cleaning in paper towel and smoothing carefully the applied layer. Repeating and smoothing. First layer is done and it's completely dry now. I waited 20-30 seconds for it to dry, and now I can move to the curved area. Why I needed to wait that the first layer is dry, so I'm not disturbing the area that was just painted by watery layer on the curved area. Then the watercolors can start to float in different directions that we don't want to do to be that way. And now I'm taking my fifth mix, which is Indian Yellow, Perlin Violet and Ultramarine Blue. Very light mix of light brown color, applying very light and transparent layer. As you can see, it's super light, super transparent. And I can see from the reference that the middle part of that curve is light, where the light is hitting the surface. Light is coming from the left side, and I'm leaving that area unpainted slightly, but also I will wipe out by washing my brush, cleaning in paper towel and wiping that area of light, removing some layer of watercolors from the surface. And while the surface is wet, it's very possible to do that, no worries, but it's important that you're painting transparently. Then everything is manageable and easier done. Also, when you are painting transparently, you are more in control of light in your painting. And with watercolor painting and realistic painting in general, it's very important to keep that light areas. Those light areas and contrast with darker areas create the illusion of 3D object on the flat surface. When we lose light, we are losing the realistic subject. carefully while the surface is still moist. I'm adding a little bit more the same watercolor mix to the darker parts and leaving the light. I'm always suggesting to leave the light area wider than it appears in the reference, because after many layers we will make it smaller, and if you will leave it from the beginning as it is in the reference, you will end up with no light area at all. And now with a finer tip brush, a darker mix of Pearl and Violet, Sennelier Red and Indian Yellow, I'm those little edges that are curved, little spiky edges of this maple leaf, painting them darker. We can see from the reference, zoom in closer your reference and take a look at those little spikes. First layer is done for the whole leaf, and now is the time to play with colors. This is a fall leaf which has a lot of color mixtures in there, and we can see from the reference there are yellows and reds and violets and browns, and just explore the reference, work with the colors that you already pre-mixed and build layers. I'm building slowly, transparently, applying, as you can see now, starting from the darker area. I very often get questions how to proceed after first layer. It seems everything is good with the first layer and then there's like a block, what to do next. My suggestion is to start from the darker area. Start from there, go towards the lightest parts. I feel more confidence in the darker areas, and then I'm slowly building. And as soon as I start to work, then it just goes with the flow, especially with these subjects when there's not so much of a control of the texture, of the tonal values. It's just a play of colors. We can see the inner part of this maple leaf, there's so many colors, and you can really play. Just stick to the plan with tonal values that you see. There are darks and there are some lighter spots in that inner part. Keep that light and build the contrast with the shadow parts. I'm working with a round synthetic brush. My brush strokes are quite big, and I'm always, after a few brush strokes of watercolors, washing my brush, cleaning in paper towel and smoothing the applied layer. So there are no hard transitions from dark to light, but everything flows smoothly, and I'm constantly checking reference. That is so crucial, so important. We can't have few looks on the reference and then just paint. No, even after many hours of painting on the big or small subject or composition, I will be constantly looking at reference, because all the information is there. I'm not thinking anything from my mind. It's not good with realistic painting, because in nature it is so rich and vibrant in colors and details. Our mind just can't figure that all on its own. That's why we need reference. When you are abstract painting or making illustrations, you can paint from your imagination. There's no details, just forms, ideas. But in realistic painting, it's all about details, it's all about tonal values, and that we have everything in the reference. The left part of this inner maple leaf is more going to the yellow side, but still there is this darker part where I'm adding the first mix of Pearl and Violet, Indian Yellow and Sennelier Red mix. Building contrast but keeping that light, moving gradually, no dark watercolor mixes. As you can see from my color palette, everything is very light, small amount of watercolors, and you don't need to be worried when you are mixing, pre-mixing watercolor mixes, small amounts of watercolor mixes, that you will run out of that mix, that's fine. That's completely fine. For example, with this painting, it's even better if you run out, then you take the same pigments, mix them again, and you get a slightly different color tone. But with this painting, you will only benefit that you have with the same pigments slightly different color tones. It will only make your painting look richer. Now I'm taking a finer tip brush and a mix of pearl and violet with the first mix. I'm placing first lines for the stem. We can see from the reference that the stem is really dry. And if we take a careful look in the reference, zoom in closer, you can pause the video at any time and take a look. It seems like there's a lot of those thin, dark violet lines. That's what I'm doing with the finer tip brush, adding those finer lines with the very tip of my finer brush. And with clean and dry brush, smoothing the applied lines, and after we will go over with another fine lines. Now taking a closer look, I added pearl and violet and ultramarine blue more to my color palette, and with a finer tip brush I will be adding those fine veins in the inner part of this maple leaf. When the leaf is dead, those veins become dark. When the leaf is alive, those veins are lighter. So with the fall leaves, it's a little bit easier to draw veins because you are going over your painting with the dark lines. It's slightly different with the live leaf, when you need to leave those areas light. But now it's amazing that you can, with the very tip of the brush, paint those fine dried veins of the leaf. Working with the very tip of the brush. If you're not sure about your fine line brush strokes, take a piece of paper, test it there first, practice there, and then go to your painting. Those secondary veins should be even more finer, more thinner. Working with the very tip of the brush. Be sure that your brush is very thin, and working with the very tip of the brush. You have the reference, you see how those veins are going, main veins, secondary veins. I will not be painting all veins that are visible in the reference. I'm not aiming for 100% accuracy, but you can try, you can work. I'm showing you the approach, and to achieve a super realistic painting, it takes hours, days, weeks, even for such a little piece. I don't have so much time for the tutorial. You will not be watching that if that would take like 10 hours. And I'm showing you the beginning stages, the approach of painting realistic painting. I always encourage to go further, to go deeper, to push yourself a little bit more, explore more. Everything is in the reference. There's so many details, so many layers that you can work on. Now with the round synthetic brush, taking very light amount of 5th watercolor mix, taking the excess amount off in the paper towel and adding to that curved area. We have in the curved area right side in the shadow and left side in the shadow. The middle part is where the light is hitting that curved surface, and we are leaving that light. Looking at reference, comparing and adding with small brush strokes to create this texture. The surface is completely dry, and as I paint, my brush also begins to be more drier, and then I smooth and make those almost like a stippling with the brush to get this texture and smoothness of that layer. Slowly adding transparently. We don't want to overpaint this curved area because comparing to the middle part, the curved area is much lighter, but still we need to manage there also contrast, because there's also shadow and there's light area, but still compared to the inner part it should be lighter. So you're not just painting curved area, you also need to think of the whole composition, how it reacts with all the areas of this maple leaf. Now with the finer tip brush, I'm adding another layer to those little spikes that are super dark and curved, but they are away from the light source. Working with the very tip of the brush, using Perlin Violet and Ultramarine Blue mix. And continuing to the inner part, the area is dry and I need now to build more contrast. I have all color tones in places, I have veins painted, light is in place, and now it's all about building more layers, more saturation of colors, because compared to the reference, my painting is still much lighter, not so rich like the reference image. So it's a matter of the same technique, just building layers one after another. And it's not about few layers. There's a lot of layers to get this richness and realistic look. I have the same watercolors as we pre-mixed, and I will be mixing finer brush strokes with more wider round synthetic brush to get the mixture of textures, of color tones, and that's how we are building richness of this subject. Still constantly checking reference, looking how those colors are going, where is slightly light visible or where I need more darkness, some spots, some extra veins. Now taking finer tip brush, a little bit more of Berlin Violet, and I need to build more darkness to those veins. As I'm adding more layers to the inner part, to the main body of the leaf, veins start to fade away because in a contrast, by comparing, they start to look much lighter. Adding a little bit more darkness, more crisper look to the stem and to the main veins. Adding more secondary veins and some extra those little details, little spots. You can now go on and really enjoy the painting of this maple leaf, go into detailing, into more exploring the reference and adding those details to the painting. All the time previous we were building the base for those details. In watercolor painting, details come almost always come the last ones. Details are that what captures our attention in the subject when we are looking for the subject. But when we are painting, what we see first is painted almost always the last. That's the tricky part, because the beautiful part you want to paint first, but that is tricky. You need to wait, you need to build that base part, you need to build that beautiful base color for the subject in order to paint details. If we will start with details, then we will paint them over by the color. It's slightly different in different mediums, but in watercolors it works that way. With a finer tip brush, I will be adding more darkness, more contrast to the curved area. Also, my brush strokes are very small and almost like a stippling in order to get this texture of uneven look from the fallen maple leaf. We can see in the reference that that part is very uneven and there's a lot of little darks and lights, and with an uneven brush strokes I'm achieving the same result, the look of that texture on this curved area. My brush is almost dry, the surface is dry, and the color palette, as you can see, is also almost dry. The water amount is so small, like, I don't know, 2%. I even can't tell you how to compare that small amount of water, but it's almost a very, very light amount of pigment, and it's rubbed in with those little brush strokes to create this texture, this illusion of uneven look. And going more into building contrast in that shadow part of the inner area of this maple leaf. Adding more Perlin violet and Indian yellow, adding more contrast to the shadow parts. I still need more greater contrast. I can see from the reference that those areas are like really dark and intense, and I still need to add another and another and another layer of the watercolors in order to get this contrast. But don't do that with the dark and saturated watercolors. You will just cover all the previous layers, and you will finish with the flat looking subject. It's all about layering. The layering is the way to get this illusion of the realistic, of very saturated and rich subject on a flat surface. Adding details, little spots. The technique is the same all the way, it's just a matter of your explorations of the reference photo. Now zooming out the painting tutorial so you can see the whole leaf in general, adding very transparent layer of Indian yellow with Sennelier red mix to give more yellowish look and color tone to this maple leaf, and it becomes more warmer looking, and I have the same look in the reference photo. adding a little bit more of Sennelier red to the shadow parts. And with the round synthetic brush, I'm making those smooth layers, carefully smooth into the other previous layers. I'm not over painting the previous ones with these watery washes of watercolors, because the layer is still transparent and all the layers underneath will be visible. I'm just incorporating them all together, more smoothing them together, blending and giving this more natural, realistic look. Adding more darkness with a finer tip brush to the stem. Also, this stem is very thin and very, maybe not so important, but no, all the details in the realistic painting are important. You can really work on the main subject, as you may think that that is the main subject, and then just few brush strokes for some stems or I don't know, any other little details, and by that you can ruin your beautifully painted main subject, because that stem is also the part of that main subject, so it's also main subject. You need to pay as much attention to that little fine stem as you do for the main leaf. And if you know that you tend to go over the edges and finish with a quite fat looking stem, my suggestion is to outline it much thinner than it appears, in order you can go over the edges a little bit while you paint. I know that I tend to do that, so I always draw my stems much thinner than they appear in the reference. I'm finishing this tutorial, this maple leaf painting, and I so enjoy painting fall leaves, especially maple leaves, and when they are curved, it's amazing. I hope you learned something new, but you can still paint on, you can still add details, work on layers, work on those little small veins, secondary veins, tiny veins, all those spots, all those details. It's up to you to push yourself with each new tutorial a little bit further. Thank you for watching, thank you for being here. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and see you in my next tutorials. Bye bye.